I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. Last time on the pod, I ended a series of episodes on the different Greek gods and goddesses. The very last one was focused on Zeus, who I've already talked about in one way or another in the Greek creation myth episodes, or in the myths more specific to the other Olympians. But one of the key points that I tried to drive home last episode about Zeus is that he is the king of the universe, and he behaved how an ancient Greek king typically behaved, and how in many ways they were expected to behave. I emphasize that point because I think it gives us at least an understanding of why the ancient Greeks praised a god who, to be honest, doesn't seem to do a lot of things that deserve praise. In fact, oftentimes, it's quite the opposite. But the reason being is that at the end of the day, Zeus is a king, and kings have a kind of license to behave badly. I talked about how Zeus is said to be so much more powerful than the other gods and goddesses, and yet his reign over the universe was not secure. He often faced pressure from the other gods, but also from various other hostile divine forces. Today, I'm going to talk about a collection of different threats to the divine order that Zeus and the other Olympians faced. Many of these are imagined as giants, superhuman beings of a very large size that fight the gods. One of these beings was Tityos. He didn't exactly fight against the Olympians himself. Instead, he was more a tool used by Olympians to fight against each other. Like a lot of beings in Greek myth, his parentage is questionable. Homer gives his mother as Gaia, the earth. Hesiod and Apollodorus say he was a son of a human princess named Elara and Zeus. According to Apollodorus, Zeus planned to hide the pregnant Elara from his wife Hera. Zeus placed the woman deep in the bowels of the earth, and deep down there, Elara gave birth to Tityos. Like the many-eyed monster Argus, Hera would later use Tityos, perhaps ironically, in trying to make life difficult for one of Zeus's other lovers. As I talked about in the Apollo episode, the young Titan Leto was the mother of Apollo and Artemis with Zeus. When Leto was pregnant, Hera tried to make the birth difficult for her by preventing the goddess of childbirth, Aletheia, from attending Leto. After Leto gave birth to her children, Hera tried to get her revenge again, and in many accounts she instigates what happens next. Leto was traveling on her way to the Oracle of Delphi, and Tityos attempted to attack or rape Leto, trying to pull her away by grabbing on her veil. But Leto called out to her children, and Apollo, and sometimes Artemis, arrived on the scene quickly, before killing Tityos by shooting him with arrows. Once dead, Tityos was punished in Tartarus for his attempted crimes. Zeus had the giant lie stretched out on the ground, covering 9 acres, while vultures came every day to bite out his liver. This punishment is actually very similar to the punishment of the Titan Prometheus. Back in episode 5, I talked about how Prometheus helped human beings and was punished because he went against the will of Zeus. But compared to Tityos, Prometheus' fate is more a tragic one. In contrast, the ancient Greeks considered what Tityos did to be very much a crime against the gods, and against the natural order. The next 2 giants actually presented a fairly decent threat to the Olympians' rule. They are called the Alouids, and they were 2 brothers named Otus, meaning either doom or, interestingly, horned owl, and Ephialtes, meaning nightmare. They are called the Alouids, or Aloeidi, after their father, Alois. Alois was married to a woman named Iphimedia, but she loved Poseidon and would often go to the sea and pour salt water into her lap. Poseidon ended up being the Alouids' real father. The Alouids themselves are not really monsters. Homer refers to them as men, meaning that they were humans, and having a human mother and a god for a father means that they're not much different than many other Greek heroes, or even from Tityos, for that matter. But they are described as giants, as being gigantic. As infants, they grew very big and very strong very, very quickly. By the time they were 9 years old, both brothers were about 54 feet, or 16.5 meters tall. With that size and strength, they began to be a threat to the gods. Ephialtes tried to seduce or rape Hera, while his brother Otis tried to do the same to Artemis. Trying to sleep with the wife of Zeus and a goddess who swore an oath to remain a virgin probably wasn't their best idea. But on top of that, the brothers tried to stack mountains on top of Mount Olympus in order to do battle with the gods or possibly kidnap Hera and Artemis, like they planned before. They threatened to fill the sea with mountains and the mountains with seawater, to make the whole world topsy-turvy. The god Ares decided to fight them, but Otis and Ephialtes defeated the war god, bound him in chains, and held him captive in a big bronze pot or cauldron. Ares stayed imprisoned for a full 13 months, a long time to be chained in a pot. That was until the Aloid's stepmother intervened. Her name was Ereboia, and she told her grandfather, who happened to be the god Hermes. Hermes managed to rescue Ares, and he snuck back to Mount Olympus. Eventually, though, the Aloid brothers were killed. Homer says they almost got in a full-out war with the gods of Mount Olympus, and probably would have done if they had been allowed to grow to adulthood. Homer says that Zeus had Apollo kill them before they were first able to grow beards. So, for all their strength, the Aloids were still children, or at least teenagers. The poet Pindar gives a location for their death, the island of Naxos. Much later, Apollodorus says that it was not Apollo who killed them, but instead Artemis. She killed them by turning into a female deer and darting between them. The brothers then accidentally hit each other with their spears. There's no mention of Poseidon fighting with his sons, so what his thoughts were on their deaths are anyone's guess. But in fact, Poseidon had more descendants that were described as giants in Greek myth. Poseidon seems to have had a lot of giant children when it gets right down to it. Back in the Artemis episode, I talked about a man named Orion, who was variously, depends on the version, a hunting companion, a potential lover, and a potential attempted rapist of Artemis. He was described as being a very large man, basically a giant, and was another son of Poseidon. But another one of Poseidon's larger-than-normal sons was Lastragon. From him came an entire race of man-eating giants called the Lastragonians. They were all said to live in Sicily, and the hero, Odysseus, came in contact with them on his return from Troy. Odysseus and his men arrived at Telephilus, a rocky fortress on the coast of Sicily where the Lastragonian king and his wife lived. His wife was described as being as big as a mountain, and the Lastragonians as a tribe were hostile to Odysseus and the human visitors. The Lastragonians even ate some of the sailors and destroyed 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships with rocks. Odysseus himself was lucky to escape with his life. These guys, the Lastragonians, they seem more like the kind of giants that we imagine in fairy tales today. They did not actually fight against the gods. They were more monsters that Greek heroes ended up fighting against. Now, when you hear the word giant, you may think of a huge person. Maybe you think of a man-eating monster, like the Lastragonians. Maybe a giant that grinds people's bones to make their bread and lives in a fairy tale castle. For the last couple examples, Tityos, the Aloids, Orion, and the Lastragonians, I've used the word giant to describe them, because they were huge humanoid beings, people who were described as being bigger than normal. We normally use the word giant today to describe size, and these last few examples all fit that pretty well. They are examples of giants from Greek mythology. However, the English word giant actually comes from the Greek word Gigantes, which, funny enough, doesn't actually mean big at all. Instead, it means earth-born, Gigantes, as in born from the earth, or born from Gaia. The giants, the capital G giants of Greek mythology, were a race of beings called the Gigantes, and they were born from the earth. But in fact, it was a bit more complicated than that. The Gigantes were very ancient beings in Greek mythology. Hesiod's Theogony tells us how they came to be, and it goes all the way back to those times before the gods, when the Titans, and before them, Ouranos, ruled the universe. The Gigantes owed their birth, at least in part, to the Titan Kronos. Back in the creation episodes, I talked about how the Titan Kronos defeated his father Ouranos. Kronos cut off the testicles of his father Ouranos with a sickle, and afterwards, Kronos held them up in front of him, and then threw them through the air. Before they landed in the sea, blood dripped off of them and landed on the ground, landing on Gaia, the Mother Earth. And from where those drops landed on the Earth, 3 different things were born. The Erinyes, or Furies, a group of fierce female spirits that avenge wrongdoing. The Meliae, the nymphs of the ash trees, or the ash trees themselves, since the trees and nymphs are often the same. And finally, the Gigantes. They were born fully grown and dressed in shining armor and already holding spears. You could say that they were born ready to cause trouble. The early Greek poet, Bacchylides, who lived around 500 BC, also calls the Gigantes sons of Gaia, as he should, since that is exactly what their name directly means. Later on, Apollodorus also says that they were the children of Uranos and Gaia. So these accounts are consistent with the view that they were born from the blood of Uranos touching Gaia. But the Gigantes were not necessarily big. The main characteristic of these Gigantes, these sons of Gaia, was their strength, their aggression, and their hubris. Hubris in ancient Greece was a very bad quality. It means excessive self-pride. And when someone was claiming to get more out of their life than the gods wanted for them, like if they said that they were a better warrior than Ares, a better king than Zeus, a better lover than Aphrodite, that sort of thing, they were showing signs of hubris, and they always paid the price. The Gigantes had lots of hubris. They thought that they were stronger than the Olympian gods, and they would go on to try to fight them for control of the universe. Apollodorus gives the Gigantes another reason for this too, besides it simply being their nature. He says that Gaia was upset at the Olympians' defeat of the Titans, and so gave birth to the Gigantes to punish the gods. As it happens, Gaia also tries to help the Gigantes in advance of the coming war. There was an oracle, a prophecy, that talked about the coming war between gods and Gigantes, and it said that the gods would only be able to defeat the giants if they got the help of mortals. Gaia heard that, and understood that the prophecy meant that if some human would fight the Gigantes on behalf of the gods, they, the Gigantes, would fail in their uprising and die. And, as it turned out, there was a magic plant, and from this plant a special potion could be created that would make the Gigantes immune to the attacks of human beings. To protect her Gigantes, Gaia began searching for the plant. But word of what was happening made its way to Zeus, too, and to stop Gaia from finding the plant, Zeus forbid Eos, Selene, and Helios, the goddess of the dawn, moon goddess, and sun god, from riding in their chariots and lighting up the sky. The earth was plunged into darkness, and Gaia could no longer search properly for this magic plant. Instead, Zeus was able to find the plant in the darkness by himself and harvested all of it, so Gaia couldn't have any. That sets the stage for the Gigantomachy, the war between Gigantes and the Olympians. Unfortunately, there were not a lot of surviving references to the war in the early Greek literature. Like the earlier war with the Titans, the Gigantomachy may have been the subject of a lost epic poem. However, it's also possible that the events of the Gigantomachy were actually avoided by Greek poets. In his Republic, the classical Greek philosopher Plato writes that people should not make the battles and duels between gods and Gigantes the subject of stories. That sounds kind of spooky, doesn't it? If that line by Plato is to be taken as is, then it seems like the Greeks treated the giants almost like they were Lord Voldemort, that they were monsters that should not be named or discussed. So terrible was their crime for warring against Zeus's order. At the same time, that advice from Plato does not seem to have been followed, because the Gigantomachy was actually very popular in Greek art, although maybe not literature. A lot of Greek vases show different battles between individual gods and Gigantes, and sometimes the Gigantes on the vases are named. References in literature do also pop up too, occasionally. From the early poets, it might be Pindar who has the most to say, and for more detailed descriptions, we have to look to Apollodorus and other later writers. The Gigantomachy was fought on the plains of Phlegra. Where this Phlegra is was open to debate. There are 3 main locations for battles between Gigantes and Olympians. Early writers located it on the peninsula of Pallene in Thrace, the wild land to the north of ancient Greece. Thrace and Pallene were sometimes described as being the homeland of the Gigantes. So if the war was fought there, it was on Gigantes' home turf. Later writers in the Roman period claimed the Gigantomachy occurred in Italy, in a region of active volcanoes. To make it more complicated, the people of Arcadia, a rugged region in southern Greece, had a tradition themselves that the war took place in the valleys around them. With all the Gigantes' hubris, the war was essentially inevitable. But, like its location, the actual cause of the war was not consistent either. As I mentioned before, one version is that it was all thanks to Gaia. It could also have been a much more mundane reason, too. One Gigantes, named Alcyoneus, was described as the king of the Gigantes from Thrace. One day, Alcyoneus, who as a king was probably quite rich, decided he didn't have enough, so he traveled to the sunset island Erythea, located at the edge of the world, and stole the cattle that belonged to the sun god Helios. In the ancient world, cattle were extraordinarily valuable. In early societies, a huge part of a king's wealth would be in cattle and livestock, so stealing cattle was as good excuse as any for going to war. Another poet, Diodorus of Sicily, gives another reason too. He says that Zeus simply decided it was time to fight the giants, because they had enslaved their neighbors, disobeyed Zeus's law, and made war against the gods generally. Wherever, though, and however it starts, the Gigantomachy soon begins. The Gigantes used rocks as weapons and threw boulders at the sky. From the various references and art pieces, it seems different Gigantes and Olympians fought separate one-on-one duels. A moment ago, I talked about how the gods would only be victorious over the Gigantes if they had help from human beings. The mortal that came to their aid was Heracles, one of the many sons of Zeus with a human woman. Heracles, or Hercules, which is his Roman name, is probably the most well-known hero from Greek myth. He was also a very busy hero, and the Greeks told of many of his quests and adventures. I won't go into detail on those today, since they need a couple episodes for themselves, but for now, let's talk about what Heracles did in the Gigantomachy. Heracles was brought to help the gods by Athena, and his weapon of choice in the coming battles was his bow and arrows. Heracles' first duel was with the giant king Alcyoneus, the one who stole Helios' cattle. The Gigantes rolled a boulder over some of Heracles' men, killing 24 people and destroying 12 chariots pulled by 4 horses each. Heracles responded by shooting Alcyoneus with arrows, and then moved in close and hit him with a club. The giant was knocked to the ground, stunned but not defeated. The reason was Alcyoneus was invincible when he was in his homeland of Pallene. Athena told Heracles this, so after he stunned the giant, Heracles then dragged the wounded Alcyoneus all the way past the border of Pallene. At that point, outside of his homeland, Alcyoneus weakened and died. The Gigantes had 7 daughters, and they mourned his death and were transformed into kingfishers, a type of bird. Next, Heracles teamed up with Zeus to fight Porphyrion. His name could mean surging, or, strangely, gleaming darkly. I like that name, gleaming darkly, but I'm not really sure how something can gleam darkly. Porphyrion was also described as a king of the Gigantes, and he attempted to rape the goddess Hera and throw the entire island of Delos at Zeus. Porphyrion was zapped by Zeus's lightning bolts and shot with arrows by Heracles. That's what Apollodorus says, anyway. The early poet Pindar leaves out Heracles in this duel. He says that Porphyrion was zapped by Zeus's lightning and shot by Apollo's arrows, not Heracles. It's also interesting that in Apollodorus's version, Porphyrion threw Delos at Zeus. Delos was an island that was the sacred spot for Apollo, so both versions have loosely some connection to him. Heracles fought with other Gigantes too. In some accounts, Heracles killed a giant named Phoetus and another named Leon, who had the head of a lion. Mylinos, a name meaning millstone, was a Gigantes killed by Zeus on the island of Crete. It's not exactly clear what exactly Mylinos was. He may have been just another name for Zeus's father Kronos, in which case he was obviously not a Gigante. But he may have been, or at least shared a name with, one of the Curetes. I talked about the Curetes before. These were those strange beings that protected the baby Zeus after Rhea hid him from Kronos. Maybe this could mean the Curetes were sometimes considered Gigantes too. After all, Hesiod or Apollodorus do not actually explain where the Curetes came from. During the Gigantomachia, Zeus chased down another Gigantes named Sychaeus, but was unable to kill him. Gaia turned Sychaeus into a fig tree, so he could escape the wrath of Zeus. The Gigantomachia was a war between the giants and all of the gods. Besides Zeus and Apollo, the other gods fought some of the Gigantes in duels too. Poseidon fought Polybotes. His name means feeding many. A Greek vase from the 400s BC shows Poseidon stabbing him with his trident. In myth, according to Apollodorus, Poseidon chased him across the sea until they reached the island of Kos. Poseidon broke a piece of the island off with his trident and crushed Polybotes beneath it. The new island was called Nisseros. You should notice that the Gigantomachia involves several people using large rocks, islands, or pieces of islands as weapons. Enceladus, sound of the charge, was one of the opponents of Athena, but Zeus's daughter eventually got the better of him and he tried to flee the battle. Athena crushed him under Mount Etna, a volcano in Italy. Another opponent of Athena was a Gigante named Pallas, spear brandishing, or sometimes called Astur. After he was killed, Athena supposedly used his skin to cover her shield. Athena was actually sometimes called Pallas Athena by the Greeks, and this giant-slaying story is one version that explains where that name came from. The god Apollo, besides possibly helping to kill Porphyrion, was responsible for defeating other Gigantes too. He shot the giant Eudaeus in the left eye, while his sister Artemis shot the Gigantes Aegeon. Their half-brother, Hermes, ever the trickster, wore the cap of invisibility during the Gigantomachia, and while invisible, he sneaked up and killed the giant Hippolytus. But I think Hephaestus had the most inventive way of fighting the Gigantes. He burned one under a flow of hot magma that he diverted over the giant. But even gods and goddesses you might not expect got involved in the war too. Hecate and Demeter fought Clytios and Erysichthon with torches, and even the three Fate goddesses teamed up with bronze maces to club a Gigantes named Agrios to death. A Greek sculpture also shows the sea nymph Thetis chasing a giant while riding a chariot pulled by lions. In Greek art, sometimes the Gigantes are labeled with names, but sometimes they are not. They usually showed the gods in the middle of small victories, and often showed almost all of the Olympians together. One vase shows Zeus in his chariot together with Heracles. Zeus holds lightning bolts in one hand, while Heracles draws a bow. A fallen giant is being trampled beneath the wheels of the chariot, and on this vase, behind the gods, alone Gaia stands, possibly begging Zeus to spare her earth-born children. In the end, after all of these duels were over, only one giant, Aristeos, was said to have survived the war, and Gaia hid him away after transforming him into a dung beetle. The Roman poet Ovid gives an interesting description that after the war was over, Gaia walked among the dead, broken bodies of the Gigantes and made their blood into a new race of human beings. But like the Gigantes, this race of mortals loved cruelty, bloodshed, and outrage. As it happens, though, in Greek myth, even though the Gigantes were dead, there were still some of their descendants. Homer's Odyssey talks about Eurymedon. Eurymedon's name means wide ruling, and he was said to be a king of the Gigantes. He may actually be the same giant as Alconius or Porphyrion, or he could be one more king of the Gigantes. If that's the case, I'm not sure if it means the Gigantomachia was a multi-generational affair, with Gigantes princes succeeding previously defeated Gigantes kings, or if there were just several names for the same giants. Anyway, the Odyssey says that this Gigantes Eurymedon had a Gigantes daughter named Periboea. Periboea actually had a son with the god Poseidon, and their son's name was Nausithous. Nausithous was the king of a people called the Phaeacians, and when he died, his son, Alcinous, became king of the Phaeacians too. The Phaeacians were not humans, though. They likely had, like their king Alcinous, some kind of supernatural divine parentage. In fact, Phaeacians had a very close relationship with the immortal gods. When the gods visited them, Homer says that they did not disguise themselves, but joined them openly. During his travels, the Greek hero Odysseus actually met the Phaeacians and their king Alcinous. The Phaeacians lived on the island of Scheria. a land so far away that its people do not meet other mortals. When Odysseus visited their island, he found the giant king living in a magnificent palace. The walls of the palace were made of bronze and shined like the sun and moon. The gates of the palace were gold, and the doorposts were silver. And on both sides of the doors there were 2 metal dogs, one gold and the other silver. They were made by Hephaestus, and these statues actually moved, too. But within the palace, there were gardens with apples, pears, and pomegranate trees. The Phæacians liked to chill out most of all. They spent their time drinking and eating, and at the end of the night they poured wine out to honor the god Hermes. Around them were statues of men with torches that lit up at night. Homer also says that they have the best ships, although I'm not really sure if you can call them ships. They were described as not having rudders or people to steer them. Instead, the ships are described as understanding what the Phæacians were thinking and setting sail right away. The Greeks clearly thought that the Phæacians had some kind of fantastic, advanced civilization, and they were not thought of as monsters, instead living lives of luxury practically alongside the gods themselves. It's interesting that the Gigantes, who warred against the Olympians, had such civilized descendants. So when I was talking about the Gigantomachy, I talked about how a lot of the information that we've gotten about the Gigantomachy comes from Greek art. The representations of Gigantes in Greek art actually changed over time. In archaic and classical Greek art, the Gigantes are depicted as heavily armed Greek soldiers, with helmets, breastplates, and spears. They look like fierce fighters, but they don't look incredibly monstrous. After around 380 BC, the depictions of the Gigantes started to shift. At that point, artists started to show them with more snake-like features, in particular with having snakes' 4 legs. Over time, that shift also began to occur in the literature. Apollodorus and Ovid are both late-period writers, one Greek and one Roman. Apollodorus described Gigantes as having a great size and strength, so like typical giants then. But he also says the Gigantes had long hair and scaly feet. Ovid describes Gigantes as being serpent-footed, a very clear match to how they were depicted in art at that time. Alongside this shift in the artwork and descriptions of the Gigantes, later myth traditions also seem to have confused the Gigantes with other opponents of the Olympian gods. This confusion often lumps the Gigantes in with the Titans, the generation of divine beings that came before Zeus and the Olympians. In the Hellenistic period, various names of Titans, like Kronos, for example, are included in lists of Gigantes. Late-period Roman writers also make references that appear to confuse Gigantes with Titans. In other examples, there was also confusion with the Gigantes and some of the other giants I talked about today. Some sources tend to confuse the Alouids, those 2 brothers who were the sons of Poseidon, with the Gigantes. Some of the Greek vases showing scenes from the Gigantomachy show giants labeled with the name Ephialtes, which is also the name of one of the Alouid brothers. This could indicate confusion between the 2 giants, or this giant may in fact be a different person and not the same as the Alouid Ephialtes. Some names do tend to repeat in Greek myth, just like how you might meet 2 people with the same name in the real world. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are the same person, but people when reading myths tend to forget this. However, even the Roman poet Ovid may have forgot this too. In his poem, The Metamorphosis, he actually merged the Alouid story with the Gigantomachy, mixing the Alouid uprising in with the Gigantes' Olympian war. I bring up these examples of confusion between Gigantes and other giants because I think it helps explain that shift in the descriptions of Gigantes from essentially armored human-looking giants to serpent-legged giants. And the best way to show that is with another giant-like monster in Greek myth responsible for fighting against the gods. That monster's name is Typhon, and he is going to prove to be another terrible threat against Zeus's rule over the universe. Next episode, it's going to be all about this Typhon and the myths of his attempt to defeat Zeus and take over the universe. You'll also hear about the different ways he was described as a monster, and see how that matches much more closely with the later descriptions of the Gigantes. And that's all for today. If you're enjoying the pod, please help get the word out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening.